Around 23,000 lives could have been saved in England alone in the first wave of the pandemic if the UK government had acted faster at the start of it. That is the conclusion in a new report from the COVID inquiry. The inquiry's chair, Baroness Hallett, says the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was presiding over a chaotic and toxic culture in Downing Street. Despite clear warning signs as COVID started to spread around the world, the response from all four UK governments was simply too little, too late, she says. It was the vulnerable and disadvantaged who suffered the most, and not enough was done to protect them. The report also criticised rule-breaking by politicians and advisers, which undermined public confidence in decision-making and significantly increased the risk of people not sticking to the rules. Our first report tonight is from our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
Government actions during the pandemic had an unprecedented impact.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
But the public inquiry says decisions were taken too slowly. That cost lives, and across the UK meant lockdowns became inevitable.
I can summarise my findings of the response as too little, too late. All four governments failed to appreciate the scale of the threat or the urgency of response it demanded in the early part of 2020.
The inquiry says there were clear early warning signs in Italy, but in the UK, the pandemic wasn't taken seriously enough. By March, COVID was spreading here, but events like Cheltenham were still going ahead. The inquiry says decision-making was still too slow.
Now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact with others.
Had this announcement come sooner, the report says the first shutdown could have been shorter or avoided altogether. But a lack of speedy action meant lockdown became inevitable by later in March.
They had no choice by then, but it was through their own acts and omissions that they had no choice.
The inquiry finds the first lockdown came too late. It should have been a week earlier, which would have meant 23,000 fewer deaths in England in the first wave. There's criticism of the way lockdown was lifted in England in the summer. Ministers were warned their plan was high risk and infections could spread quickly. The inquiry says that Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme was devised without scientific advice and undermined public health messaging. By autumn, cases were on the rise, and again the inquiry finds a lack of swift action in Downing Street. Approaches across the UK varied, but Boris Johnson, the report says, repeatedly changed his mind and failed to make timely decisions.
The whole point, Mr. Speaker, is to seize this moment now to avoid the misery of another national lockdown.
The inquiry says he should have introduced a short circuit breaker in England like elsewhere. Not doing so meant a lengthier lockdown later and a bigger economic impact. In the run-up to Christmas, a similar pattern. A new strain of the virus was spreading. Governments across the UK failed to take decisive action. Mistakes were repeated before another lockdown just days before Christmas. The report paints a damning picture of what went on behind this door. There was a toxic and chaotic culture at the heart of the UK government, it says. Boris Johnson often encouraged it. Matt Hancock overpromised and underdelivered. The behaviour of Dominic Cummings was destabilising. And there's more. The Cabinet was sidelined in decision-making. Parliament didn't have enough of a role. And there was a lack of trust between the Prime Minister and devolved leaders in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The COVID pandemic leaves many lasting legacies. Today's inquiry report paints a picture of action that was confused and slow, having a devastating impact. And there is a lot to digest tonight from these 2 volumes of this report, 750 pages in total. It also talks about perceived breaches of the rules in Downing Street, such as Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle, and talks about how that created a great deal of hurt in the country and undermined public confidence in what politicians were doing. We've not heard from many of the main players. Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock are yet to comment tonight. Mr Cummings has criticised the process and says it allows a rewriting of history. But the main takeaway is this: there were repeated failures to get ahead of the virus, to work out what needed to happen next. And Lady Hallett blames a lot of that on chaos in Downing Street.
Nick, thank you. Well, there was praise for the UK government on the rollout of the COVID vaccine at the end of 2020. It was called a decisive turning point and a remarkable achievement. But today's report went on to say that a failure to learn from initial mistakes during later waves of the pandemic was inexcusable. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, who was with us night after night during the pandemic, is here with me now. The chaos at the heart of the government, the indecision is really striking in this report. And we now know that so many more people may not have died in that first wave if the government had acted faster.
Yes, Sophie, that figure of 23,000 lives which could have been saved, according to estimates, if there'd been an earlier intervention, is pretty shocking and really shows the impact of decisions which were and weren't made. Let's look at a chart which shows one of the situations at that time in the early stages of the first wave. That's the numbers in hospital with COVID, and you can see that sharp peak. Now, many of those possibly wouldn't have survived. So essentially, what Baroness Hallett is saying is with earlier intervention, that would have been a lower figure. And then the report says that mistakes were made and there were no lessons learned. And so let's see what happens in the second big wave. And you can see there how the peak in January 21 was so much higher than the previous peak because of that lack of learning from the first time. One of the report's other key areas is that the vulnerable were not protected adequately, disabled people, those from ethnic groups and older people. And one figure which stands out, 34% in April 2020 of critically ill patients in England and Wales and Northern Ireland were from ethnic minorities when they represented 14% of the population.
And it also focuses on what has happened since then. The lasting legacy of all this is still the effect it's having.
Yes, there was ill health for some time after the pandemic because stay at home, protect the NHS, some people just stayed away. So another chart which I can show is the number of cancer referrals and appointments with consultants, which normally happened in the run-up to 2020. And you can see that sharp falling away with people just staying away from their treatments, drawing up problems for the future. Obviously, a success for science and health was the rollout of the vaccine programme. The report saying it was a remarkable achievement. Recommendations, though, do focus on change, better protection for vulnerable groups in pandemic planning, and a bit of a rethink of the Committee of Scientific Advisors, SAGE, to have a broader range of experience on that committee.
Hugh Pym, thank you. Well, the report looked in detail at the response of governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We're going to hear from James Cook in Edinburgh, Chris Page, who's in Belfast, but first, Hal Griffith, who is in Cardiff. And how the report highlights the mortality rate in Wales during the second wave of COVID. It says the way decisions were taken by Welsh ministers at the end of 2020 were likely to blame.
Yes, Sophie, the report finds failings by the Welsh Labour government several stages during the pandemic, from the very early days of 2020 when there was no planning or strategy. Ministers hadn't even anticipated being in control of lockdown. But it is that period towards the end of 2020, as you say, where potentially more crucial failings have been found. Between August 2020 and December, the mortality rate here in Wales was higher than other parts of the UK. And according to the report, that's more than likely due to several failings. First of all, a failure coming out of the summer months with local restrictions, then hesitancy in introducing that 2-week firebreak autumn lockdown, and then finally easing restrictions before the scientists advised it. Now, the man in charge of Welsh Government decisions at that time was the former First Minister Mark Drakeford. We've spoken to him this evening. He says he's yet to read the full report, but he wanted to defend the decisions made by his government.
That autumn period was a very challenging period. Indeed, Wales was the only part of the United Kingdom to have a lockdown earlier, because we could see the way in which the virus was again getting a grip on Wales. If there are things that the report has to say about that, we will, of course, think about them very seriously.
Now, the report describes Mr Drakeford as a careful and considered leader who had a positive relationship within Wales. Contrast that to what it calls the chaos at the heart of the UK government and the tensions between the decisions made here and those made in Westminster.
Hal, thank you. Chris Page in Belfast. Decision-making in Northern Ireland is described in this report as chaotic and incoherent, and it says that a lot of that stemmed from power sharing at Stormont.
Yes, Sophie, the largely unique power-sharing system of devolved government here at Stormont was designed to protect a peace process, but it contributed to chaos during the pandemic. The report says the independence of individual government departments was incompatible with managing an emergency, that relations between ministers were strained and important meetings were beset by leaks. Baroness Hallett was particularly critical of the two biggest parties, Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionists. In one of her most scathing lines, she says that at a time of extraordinary crisis, some politicians were not always able to set aside political and sectarian divisions to govern in the best interests of everyone. The report points to autumn 2020 when restrictions were extended for a week, then lapsed for a week and then reintroduced for another 2 weeks. And that lapsed week was linked to a 25% rise in COVID cases. Baroness Hallett warns that the dysfunction in decision-making in Northern Ireland should never be repeated.
Chris, thank you. And to James in Edinburgh. Scotland comes out better from this report, at least at the start of the first wave, because the response is described as stringent and swift. There was, though, criticism of the way that decisions were taken by the government.
Yes, that's exactly right, Sophie. Baroness Hallett does praise the relatively more cautious approach of the Scottish Government, and she describes Nicola Sturgeon, who was First Minister during the pandemic, as a serious and diligent leader. But she does criticise Ms Sturgeon's tendency to take decisions without minutes in a small group which was known as Gold Command. Now, the inquiry says this approach reduced transparency and deprived decision makers of a wide range of views. And as an example, it highlights the sidelining of Cabinet by Ms Sturgeon and the now First Minister John Swinney when they alone took the call to close schools. Now, when Ms Sturgeon was asked about this and questioned about whether this was the right approach this afternoon, she did sound pretty defiant.
The inquiry's reflection, I think that's a fair word, that decision-making in the Scottish Government might have been overly centralised. My ministers and all relevant officials played a full part in decision-making. However, it was a very conscious and deliberate decision of mine at the outset of the pandemic to lead from the front and to make very clear that the buck stopped with me. And I want to be clear today that I stand by that decision, and if the clock was to be turned back, I would make that decision again.
Now, the inquiry did find there was no evidence that either the Scottish or UK governments allowed political considerations to influence their decision-taking during the pandemic, but it was critical of the relationship between Boris Johnson and all the First Ministers of the UK, including Nicola Sturgeon. And the pandemic, Baroness Hallett says, has revealed both strengths and weaknesses of the UK's devolved system. She says structures should now be strengthened and political division minimised to ensure a better response to future public health emergencies.
James,
Sophie.
thank you.